But just before that, let's keep economics aside for a moment.
Sure.
Ralph Waldo Emerson had once said that money often costs too much. Can you comment on the psychological impact of money? Does money influence the way people think and feel? And as a follow-up to that, what do you think is the link between money and power? Do you think they work hand in hand?
I'm sure we can spend hours just discussing this one question.
It's a 24-hour podcast. Let's go.
But let's start with the first idea of a hedonic treadmill. So this idea came around, call it about 30 to 40 years ago with Campbell. And the idea is, on this hedonic treadmill, humans regulate emotions and go from a positive emotion or a negative emotion very quickly to a flatline base. What that does is, if you experience a very big expression of positive emotion, over time that positive emotion dwindles down and you have a flatline emotion base. And similarly with sort of a trauma, over time that trauma shovels and you reach away from that trough into some sort of a straight line emotional base. So this hedonic treadmill idea was that over time, even after accruing enough money, you realize that your happiness eventually comes down to a flat line structure. So initially, it was linked to an idea of increased happiness, but over time, that increased happiness has now come to flat surface level. And then this cycle transcends again, where more money is required to come back to that high of happiness that you had attained in the past. And this cycle of increased money that links to an increase in happiness that then fizzles out over time and then asks for more money continues. And that's sort of the idea of the hedonic treadmill, is that you keep walking on this cyclic process of money, and it comes back to, yes, in the end, money does cost too much. It costs you an entirety of psychological impact. To understand the sort of your second idea of psychological impact and money, let's take a thought experiment into play. Let's give a child, or let's give two children a set of money and ask them to spend it on what they prefer and what they like the most. So we'll find two children, we'll give them, call it $5, and ask them to run and buy whatever they can find and buy. Oftentimes you notice that the goods that purchased by children are somewhat similar in a sense that it's generally some sort of consumable that will over time increase their happiness after they've consumed it. And over time, they realize that, oh, this was a great exercise, and they were really happy with it. And they will not generally come back and ask for more because they had that sort of increase in happiness and they were happy with it, and they're continuing to be happy. With adults, it's sort of flipped around. This research showed once that if you give two adults a similar amount of money, generally speaking, the goods and services that they go ahead and buy with this money are very varied. And they really depend on the interests and the alignments of the humans in conversation. So sometimes you might find that this money was spent on consumables. Sometimes you might find that it was held safely for future use. And on other occasions, you might just find that people lost the idea of the money and probably just lost the money itself. So they put it in their pocket, realized that, oh, I reached this shop, I now don't have the same jacket that I was wearing, and this money was held there, and then over time, they just find the money much later. This is all to come back and show that the idea of happiness is a lot similar when you are a child, but the idea of happiness grows varied, and the notion of happiness obtained can change very quickly in adults. So this hand-in-hand notion of money and happiness really starts intensifying in adults, because adults start conflating money with an equation of what they can purchase or what they can value. And this psychological interpretation of money and happiness then increases as you age. And that's the idea of this hedonic treadmill that we discussed about as well. On the flip side, you had Daniel Kahneman, who was a Nobel laureate in 2002, who wrote a paper in 2010. And the paper was about this equation, and he had about a 1.3 million data points, so a rather large subset of data, where he talked about the increase in money and the increase in happiness in individuals up to a certain threshold, after which the diminishing value of money came into play. And so the increase in happiness was not as much as it was for the initial threshold. I think he changed the threshold depending on which nation was observed, but in the US, it was somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars, in the upper tens of thousands of dollars. And over time, he realized that after that sort of threshold, people didn't value happiness as much. If they were given the same incremental dollar, the increase in happiness was not as much as when they were given the first dollar. And so on one side, you have this idea of, oh, there is this finite theory that regardless of when I give you money, there's an increase in happiness. And then over time, that happiness sort of fizzles out. On the other side, you have Daniel Kahneman's theory, which has that over a certain threshold, incremental money doesn't really influence your happiness anymore. And so there's always a big question of what influence does money have on happiness.